Welcome to Spin Out.
I'm Dave,
And I'm Winner.
and we're here to demystify venture
Minimize FOMO.
and discuss the relationships between GPs and LPs.
Today, we're getting back to our mini series on how to fundraise. So we'll leave a couple links throughout this video back to episode 15. But in the last episode on fundraising, we focused on how to start fundraising, the market research component, then the details behind pre-launch and the official launch, particularly noting that this is an iterative process. Today's episode, we're going to focus on something similar, but a little bit different.
Yeah, we're zeroing in on operations, right? That is the foundation of which you build upon your fundraising processes and systems, right? So if you don't have those systems, those tools, the processes in place, you're going to be spending a lot of time fixing operational debt, reworking, or just missing opportunities to close on an LP.
So I think the good news for us spending time on fundraising operations is that, again, similar to fundraising in general, it's an iterative process, right? So we're going to give you a framework to think about for building your, what we're going to call minimum viable fundraising operations, your MVFO. Dave released another series about a year ago focused on minimum viable operations for your fund. This is similar, but it's going to be a little bit different, talking about minimum viable fundraising operations. So this is specifically going to focus on the operations you need to set up initially, before and during your go-to-market for fundraising.
And I think that's the critical part, Winner. So what we want to do when we set up these tools or we set up these processes is not overdo it, right? As a GP, you want to focus most of your time and energy and effort on LPs and even starting to build your deal flow out. And so what we want is to make sure that you get on the right side of that Pareto principle, where you're spending 80% of your time on those outwardly facing, ultimately fund driving kind of activities, and then the right amount of time on building out the fund operations. So that minimum viable fundraising operations mindset kind of covers a couple of areas when you're fundraising, right? So specifically, you got to think about legal. We work in a regulated industry. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what are the legal requirements that you need to do to just get started, and not necessarily the full package, but what do you need on day one? We're going to talk about the finance function, which really revolves around how can you actually start to purchase services and goods and how do you pay for things? And then we're going to talk about the simple software stack. What tools do you need in place to help you track your meetings, to help you build your materials, or just run your business day to day? And then lastly, we're going to think about some of those other services that you'll need where you'll want to plan for them, but they're not necessarily essential on day one. Your LPs, though, will want to make sure you've thought about it. So while we don't need to turn on these services, we do want to have a good plan for what we're going to do when we get to that. So Winner, I'll turn it back over to you. Why don't we start with legal? What are some of the basic legal things that a GP must do when they're just kicking off fundraising?
I think the first thing you want to do on the legal side, and again, this isn't legal advice, but it's our focus on operations and kind of the help thinking about what you need to do when you're initially setting up. But I'd say the way to think about legal is in three buckets. So the first bucket is you go with a well-known firm. A lot of emerging managers do this. If you're expecting to raise a slightly larger fund, this is a pretty standard way to engage. But you can start engaging with that large firm without spending a lot of dollars. You can first have an initial meeting to make sure it's a good fit. You can ask them questions, again, to make sure there's alignment there, that they're the right firm for your product, right? Make sure you're getting if you're a venture fund, you're getting a lawyer that's experienced in venture fund formation. And then lastly, again, you don't have to spend a lot of dollars up front even if you're using a tier one brand name legal firm. You can actually start with a set of terms for your fund, subject to change, a much shorter, like couple page document that sets out the terms that'll eventually make it into your legal contract, your limited partnership agreement. But, this will cost you a couple $1,000s. This could cost you a lot more, right? The LPA could cost you a lot more than summary terms. So our advice would be start with summary terms, if you're going to go with a big law firm, because then you can manage your costs over time. The second bucket in legal is there's, a number of other firms that are just, for whatever reason, lighter weight. Maybe they have a home office instead of kind of like a corporate office. Maybe there are fewer lawyers kind of involved, and it's just like a leaner operation overall. And so there are kind of specialist practices. And again, depending on what strategy you are, again, if you like very simply, if you're a venture manager, there can be specialist firms that they don't have the brands, that the Sandhill Road firms are using, but they do specialize in venture and they tend to be kind of cost effective as well. And then I'd say the third bucket is, and this is true for a number of venture funds, is they go with kind of the standardized platform. So again, we won't name names, but there are kind of standardized docs that you can use across several platforms if you're a smaller fund. And maybe you want to start there, right? And kind of build the initial track record there. Again, with the intention of, ease of onboarding for LPs, ease of kind of use for you. And again, it's a cost effective way to kind of get started and build your initial track record. So those are kind of the three ways to think about legal, but two big picture things. One, there's choices. You can go, tier one, you can go specialized, or you can go kind of, software platform. And then, two, you shouldn't think you need all of the documents up front, right? You like make sure if you're working with a tier one, you're getting that summary of terms. If you're working with a specialized firm, just starting with the terms as well. And if you're working with the platform, understand how that works and kind of, how cost is kind of layered into that process over time. Cause I think it gives you more optionality and gives you more choices up front.
So that makes a lot of sense, Winter, for the fund side, right, of legal. On the management company side, I like to think of a few basic things you want to get going just to start out with. So if you do have a business partner in this, there's more than one GP, you're going to want to spend just a little bit of time building out that same kind of term sheet idea for your LPA, but for your own management company operating agreement, right? Just spend a little bit of time making sure y'all are both on the same page, or if there's multiple partners, everyone's on the same page about the big things that could happen in the life of a company. And so you want to find a lightweight, easy way to do that. You want to make sure you get your federal, employer identification number, get registered as a local business or a business in your state to operate for your management company. And then depending on some, initial considerations, you and your other co-GPs may want to consult a lawyer or tax professional to think through some of those tax considerations. But again, this is for your management company, not for the bigger fund. You just want to make sure that the initial entity that you're setting up to get into business, that you do some of those things the right way to start and save some of the more complex conversations for later. But at least you have, started the process of setting up your management company, getting an operating agreement, figuring out where you're going to register your business and thinking through the setup of it from a tax perspective. That's like that's the bare minimum you should be doing when you're just getting started out on legal.
Yeah. And I think, again, there's probably two camps there. Like if you're a solo GP, you're not negotiating against yourself in the operating agreement. That could be a much more streamlined process. But if you are not a solo GP and you're starting with a team, do spend time there, right? I think this gets vastly overlooked a lot of times. And again, I would probably, going back to like you've hired a lawyer, use them for this piece as well, just to make sure, again, the language is clear, everyone's on the same page. There's, as few misunderstandings as possible. And that this is a very kind of aligned business from the get-go across the team.
Great. So we've got our legal in place. That's kind of step one. Step two is probably going to banking. And I think that's just the natural order of things. One, you need your federal employment identification number and a simple operating agreement to open a bank account. So you do the legal, then you go over to the bank and you're starting to establish that minimum viable finance function. So what are some of those things that you see as just a basic minimum finance function as someone is a fundraising winner?
If the fund isn't off the ground, if you haven't had a close, you don't need fund banking just yet. But you do want to start thinking about fund banking, right? So working with a bank, again, we're using the venture example here. If you're launching a venture fund, think about venture fund banking. Think about a banker that's going to be helpful to you with your venture fund, because that's different than commercial banking. So again, I would think about that. I say that first because some people start with the commercial bank and then they're like, oh, I'll set up my fund banking on the back of my commercial bank, but their commercial bank doesn't do venture fund banking. And I think that's something to really think about. So set up the commercial bank probably at the same bank that you're expecting to launch the fund banking, but you don't need to set the fund banking up yet because you don't have a fund yet, right? So you're setting up the commercial banking for your business, for your management company, for the LLC, for the operating business that you just set up and defined your operating agreement around. So that's what you're setting up the bank account for. And why do that? Because again, like if you get the fund off the ground, you can pay back some of those expenses that, you've invested into this business to launch this business. You want to keep track of all that. And again, I think you also want to keep your liabilities separate from the rest of your life, right? I think a lot of people commingle personal and fund or personal and management company. I think I would just make sure that, you're creating a commercial bank account underneath your LLC and you're running everything with respect to your fundraise through that account.
Those are great points. And things I see GPs kind of slip up and make some early mistakes is exactly what you laid out there is the commingling. So you get your business set up, you go get your management company checking account set up. You may at that same bank be able to open a credit card, or you may have to go make a decision. You want to get a Ramp card, Brex card, you want Amex, whatever. You're going to have to make a decision on how you're going to actually go out and pay for things. And you want to be able to keep track of all of that. And I think the key thing to remember is while we're setting up minimum viable fund finance operations, the key in that viability is centralizing transactions, recording what's important so that we can go back later and reimburse for fundraising expenses or allocate to the fund or, separate out business versus personal as required. We can do that stuff. And so the goal is you just want to start centralizing like the information flow. You want to pick a good bank that's got good technology that, to your point about commercial versus fund banking, you want to pick a bank that understands how to onboard a venture fund from a risk perspective, that you're going to get all these capital call wires in, that's not going to throw their system for, a loop, that they understand how venture funds work and that they offer some of the other products that people are going to want down the line. You don't need to have those conversations today, but just knowing that they're available will help you out down in the future. All right, so you've set up a checking account, you've got your credit card potentially at that bank or somewhere else, and then you're thinking about just a few other pieces that you want to set up for the future. Maybe a line of credit conversation, maybe some other products that the bank offers to help protect some balances, things like that. But it's not a huge lift from the banking perspective. It's just getting those first accounts open and just getting the relationship kicked off. All right, so winner, once you get through setting up legal, setting up finance, you and the partnership, your other partners have gotten those basic things in place. You've got a credit card, you can start purchasing things. What are some of the tools, some of the software that you see the firms you work with initially make decisions about and ultimately purchase just to get off the ground, to get fundraising going?
Again, I think the point here is the separation between church and state. So you have your personal expenses and all of that, and then you have the kind of business expenses. And I would think about this bucket. So we have legal as bucket one, banking as bucket two, kind of a simple software stack as bucket three. This bucket now, right? Like you have your credit card, what do you use it for? You're buying the very simple infrastructure of a business. Do not overcomplicate this. Like basically buy Google or Microsoft, and then swipe the credit card again for your CRM. And again, it's an iterative process. So be open to maybe switching CRMs in the beginning, or, if you have a bias because you're coming from one world and using a CRM over there, maybe that's not the best CRM actually for your current workflow. So making sure you understand that that can change both from like your, prior experiences, but also from like your current function, right? Which is fundraising. And so I would, test out some CRMs, and kind of go with the one that, you feel most comfortable with and kind of hits your use cases for your business.
Right. And so I typically see people, as you said, they first get that knowledge management, basic, operating system tool. They get the CRM. You sometimes will see people start to experiment with some AI tools. They may purchase some marketing materials or marketing tools to help with like newsletters or just things like that for distribution. And you'll see people probably spend a couple $100 at this level, but it is not building out the full operational software stack that's built for the entire team. You've got all the enterprise licenses and you're spending lots of money. These are, again, focused very much on the basic blocking and tackling of fundraising and not setting yourself up for, $1,000+ a month in software expenses before you've gotten to your first close. So yeah, that all of those tools make a lot of sense to me. All right. So last bucket that we're going to switch to now is thinking about this kind of miscellaneous, this other bucket, this number 4, some of the other pieces that you want to get in towards, want to build into your plan, but don't necessarily need to fully action yet. So what are some of these things that you want to set up or maybe have conversations about? You want to be able to share with your prospective LPs that you've got a plan in place, but aren't necessarily ready yet to be executed upon.
You want to set these things up. But again, what we're trying to do here is help you think through what's kind of the minimum viable fundraising operations versus if you had hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in AUM
Mm.
and you could, spend on everything under the sun, your stack might look a little bit different. So in this case, you're going to work your way up to that. But in the beginning, again, you have the minimum viable legal. You have to think about, okay, what does that look like going forward? Kind of what are my expenses going to be? Have a sense of that, right? Like you might spend a couple thousand up front, but if your bill's going to turn into a couple 100,000, understand that up front, right? Because that might influence kind of where you go in the beginning. So just again, understanding this stuff up front, even if you're not spending the money, understanding where it's going to go.
Well, I was going to say on the legal piece before we move on, but making sure you understand those triggers with your fund attorney of what gets them to initiate the next round of work and start those billing cycles is like have that conversation with them up front of what are the next steps and what do you need from me to start work or prevent work. That way they don't send you a $50,000 bill when you weren't necessarily expecting it. But yeah, that is definitely a good point. So about fund banking, you were going on about that?
Yeah, so we've already kind of mentioned the fund banking piece, which is thinking about if you're going to start commercial banking with a bank, maybe this is up to you, but maybe you also want that bank to be experienced with fund banking. There's a number of kind of known banks that do commercial banking, but they also do fund banking, right? They have a dedicated fund banking team, right? Someone you can get on the phone. They understand venture finance. They can like help you work through some of these more nuanced or complex issues that are going to arise as you launch your fund and manage your fund. So that's something to think about in terms of like if you raise your fund, your banking is going to become more complex. And so again, something to think about in terms of the relationship with your bank. You're also thinking about, if you go with the platform and you're using standardized docs, right? Tier one legal, specialized legal, kind of platform legal. If you go with the platform, sometimes they will manage your fund admin as well. But if you have a separate independent kind of fund administrator, you don't have to sign them up, like, right, like you don't have to start paying them because there's no fund to administer yet, right? Like you start paying for the service once there's a fund to administer, but you can again negotiate that contract, get that set up to sign, right? Make sure you're on their radar and you're not just coming to them the next day saying like, hey, it's Friday, on Monday I need you to start kind of managing my fund. Give them a couple weeks, a couple months of kind of like, lead in and make sure that is negotiated up front.
I would say no, I would say on fund admin, what we typically do is about 30 days prior to the first close. And that's a moving target, right? If you try to set a date for your first close, but about 30 days beforehand, you get this sense that things are coming together. That's a good time to really start digging in on fund admin and some of these other providers, but specifically there, because then you have good line of sight into what your LP base is going to be like. Maybe you're getting some feedback from some of those initial LPs on which fund admins they do or don't like, and you're integrating all that feedback into your vendor selection process, and then you make a choice. And you want to give your fund admin a couple of days with the documents to get them uploaded into the portal. You got to be thinking about all these different pieces. So yeah, about 30 days ahead of time from when your first close is happening is when you want to lock in or think about deeply your fund admin. But you were saying tax and audit. How do you see those typically playing out?
Tax and audit is the same, right? So as we're recording this episode, it's a very busy time for, anyone in the tax world, right? And that starts to lighten up kind of, mid to end of April. So just thinking about the timing, again, from an empathy perspective, tax and audit are two more. You don't need to pay for them now, right? And a lot of times if you are having a close, right, like towards the end of the year or beginning of the year, and a lot of times if you're having a close at the beginning of the year, I would think about it as, you have a lot of time to kind of choose your tax provider and kind of implement that tax provider. We're at the beginning of, 2026. If you were to hire a tax person now, really they wouldn't be doing work for another year, right? And so, I mean, again, thinking about the timing here, like you're not in a rush. You want to kind of pick the relationship, understand the team you're going to be working with, understand the provider you're going to be working with. But again, you don't need to be in a rush to kind of like spend money here, but you do need to line up that relationship and that provider. Same thing with audit. And then lastly, Dave, do you want to touch on insurance?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, D&O insurance is one of those ones where there's a couple of pieces. It's very confusing. The insurance industry kind of runs on complexity, but there's a couple pieces to think about. You probably don't need full D&O insurance on day one, but you want to start identifying an insurance broker for your business and have that initial conversation. Again, once you get through your close, that's when you want to kind of accelerate something like insurance, but you want to have a good plan for it. You want to understand what the potential costs will be, and you want to be able to speak to it if your LPs ask during diligence. what is your plan for D&O insurance? And then there's also, aside from the directors and officers piece, there's just normal business owners insurance and professional liability insurance that that broker can help you out with once you're in business. Not necessarily something you need to do before your first close, but finding a good broker, finding someone in your network that you can work with that understands venture and understands your business. That is kind of like the key action to take during the fundraising piece so that you can turn it on once you get to that close. So one of the keys to remember in this prepared for group of activities amongst fund admin and tax and audit is that in some cases there's interdependencies and you want to think about the whole stack. So that's why it's good to give yourself options and take your time. And as you get closer to your actual close of the fund, start to make some decisions because maybe your tax and audit comes bundled together and you get some good preferential pricing there. Maybe the bookkeeping service that you hire to help with your management company and to help kind of keep the fund operations running will also do tax, right? So you want to kind of understand what are the different services and how they're interconnected, and if there's any benefits to gain or better pricing if one service provider does multiple of these things for you. So that's definitely a part of your consideration as you're going through this process while you're planning out this service provider offering before you kind of close and finalize everything.
This is a 5-part series on how to fundraise, especially focus on, minimum viable fundraising operations. The next 3 episodes are going to be on data room, kind of the minimum viable data room, like how do you build an initial data room? Again, you don't need to over engineer it here. Track record, kind of, how to, build that out and communicate that appropriately to limited partners. And also lastly, how to onboard LPs. And so I think we'll talk about a couple of workflows there in onboarding LPs and tactics there for onboarding LPs efficiently. Um, Turning our attention to the last part of the episode, did you see? I think it ties into what we're discussing on this series. This actually came out a couple weeks ago, but it is I would point everyone's attention to it is Witham's Emerging Manager Desk Reference Manual, 9th edition. So there's some deep ties with what we're discussing today to this manual. We'd recommend checking it out. But again, you're the themes are very similar. You're building a business, right? You don't need to build everything up front. Kind of build a minimum viable piece up front. You're getting the foundations correct early, right? Like to Dave's point, you don't want to go into operational debt. So getting legal, finance, tax, getting the structure kind of correct up front, and then just like that empathy of you can iterate, you can change, like especially in the early days when there isn't a lot of operational debt there, it's okay to kind of switch out if something's not working. What you're trying to do is build kind of the best, most efficient business possible. And that's what we're trying to guide you through here.
Great. All right. Looking forward to those episodes and we'll see you in the next one.
All right. Thanks, everyone.